Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining us in today's webinar. My name is Shamma Al-Mamari, Monitoring and Enforcement Specialist at ADGM, and I will be the moderator for today's session. Joining me will be Tim Land, Natalie Scott, and Katrina Bradley. Today's session is going to be an overview of the economic substance requirements for ADGM entities. Please feel free to share questions through the session with us, as we are going to be answering them in the Q&A session. I will hand over now to my colleagues to present themselves, starting with Natalie.
Thank you very much, Emma, and good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our session. My name is Natalie Scott, and I'm a Senior Legal Counsel who is assisting our Economic Substance team with administering the regime in ADGM. Over to you, Tim.
Thanks very much, Natalie. Good afternoon, everyone. Really excited to have you join us this afternoon for this session on economic substance. My name is Tim Land, Executive Director, Monitoring and Enforcement at the Registration Authority of ADGM, and heading up the economic substance team, and really looking forward to deep diving in particular into the annual notification today. Now I'll hand over to Katrina.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Tim, for inviting me along today. I'm Katrina Bradley, the Founding Director of EDIF Consulting, a compliance, risk and governance firm in the ADGM. It's my pleasure to hand you back to Shamma. Thank you.
So coming to the agenda, we will start by giving you a brief background on economic substance, after which we are going to give you an overview of the regime. We will also discuss the relevant activities as well as the annual notification requirements. Following that, you are going to have a look at industry perspectives as well as best practices, and then we will conclude with a Q&A session. I would like to remind you to send your questions through as we go through the slides. Coming to the background, the economic substance regulations were introduced as part of the UAE's commitment as a member of the OECD Inclusive Framework and as a response to an assessment of the UAE's tax framework by the European Union. As a response to that, the UAE created a regime that consists of the Cabinet Resolution number 31 of 2019, as amended by Cabinet Resolution number 7 of 2020, Ministerial Decision number 215 of 2019, and Cabinet Decision number 58 2019. So to give you an overview of this regime, I will hand over now to my colleague Natalie.
Thank you very much, Shama. As Tim has already mentioned, the focus of today's session is going to be on annual notification requirements, particularly since those are due for many of our licensees within the next week. However, to put those requirements into context, what we will do is give you a little bit of an overview of the economic substance regime to recap on some of the key concepts. So first of all, economic substance is a federal regime. It is being applied across the UAE, including both free zones and financial free zones. Under the regime, the Ministry of Finance is the competent authority. So we appreciate that some of the terminology in the regime may not align exactly with the regulatory requirements in ADGM regulatory framework that you may be familiar with. We are working hard at ADGM to make sure that we communicate the requirements to all of our licensees that are engaged in both financial and non-financial regulatory activities. Under the regime, regulatory authorities, of which ADGM is one, have an obligation to administer the economic substance regime within our respective jurisdiction and to then report to the competent authority, the Ministry of Finance. The Ministry is then required to disclose certain information to foreign competent authorities in relation to entities that either did not meet the economic substance requirements or that have been categorized as carrying out a high-risk IP business. A little bit more on that later. Under the regime, a licensee is anyone who is licensed to carry out a relevant activity, and for the purposes of ADGM, who is located in or is operating from ADGM. You will see that there is a concept of an exempt licensee, which is a licensee that is majority owned by the UAE government, either federal or local. The onus here is on the licensee to provide evidence to support their exempt status. In ADGM, the registration authority has been appointed to administer the economic substance regime across all relevant activities, including both financial and non-financial. So whether you are conducting a banking or insurance business, your point of contact will be the registration authority. And again, we will cover off on that a little bit later. So let's now take a look at some of the relevant activities that are captured by the regime. As you can see on the slide, you've got the 9 activities, which can be divided broadly into financial and non-financial. And Tim and I will talk about these in a little bit more detail a little later in the session. But you can see that it captures the so-called geographically mobile activities that require evidence of genuine economic activity taking place in the UAE, essentially to reduce the risk of base erosion and profit shifting. As an overall requirement, you can see that all licensees, including those licensees that are exempt, are required to submit the annual notification, which is the aspect that Tim will discuss shortly. And only those licensees that are non-exempt and that derive income from the relevant activity during a financial year will then be required to meet the economic substance test and then file the economic substance return. And again, more on that later. So let's now recap briefly on the economic substance test requirements. The general economic substance test applies to all relevant activities with the exception of a holding company business and a high-risk IP business. These have their own tests, which we will touch on in a moment. But looking at the remaining activities, you can see that the test requires the licensee to satisfy all 3 elements. That is, that the core income generating activities must take place in the UAE, that the relevant activity must be directed and managed in the UAE, and that adequate employees, expenditure, and assets must be located in the UAE. Now, in relation to the requirement to be directed and managed in the UAE, I'd like to draw your attention to the recent COVID-19 industry advisory notification that was issued by the Ministry of Finance. This confirmed that the Ministry is cognizant of the disruptions that are being caused by the pandemic, particularly in light of the travel restrictions and quarantine requirements that have been imposed worldwide. And these will be taken into account when making a determination whether or not the licensee has demonstrated sufficient economic substance. Now, obviously, this is only a temporary measure, and it only applies to periods affected by the pandemic. In other words, compliance with the requirements in 2019 is unlikely to be influenced by the COVID-19 pandemic. Licensees are therefore encouraged to make every effort to otherwise comply with their obligations. Coming back to the other two elements of the test, the requirement to have core income generating activities and adequate employees, expenditure and assets in the UAE. These may be outsourced in certain circumstances. So let's recap what these are. As you can see, what cannot be outsourced is the requirement to be directed and managed for obvious reasons. But the requirement to conduct core income generating activities and to have sufficient employees, expenditure and physical assets and premises can be outsourced to either an adequately resourced third-party service provider or to a related entity. The important thing to bear in mind here is that the onus remains on the licensee to continue accurate reporting to the regulatory authority in respect of all core income generating activities that are outsourced. The third-party provider must also ensure that they are adequately resourced and are in the UAE. And finally, it goes without saying that outsourcing must not be used to circumvent the economic substance test. As I've mentioned, there are a couple of variations in the test for holding company business and high-risk OP business. So let's now take a quick look at these. A holding company business, essentially a business that holds equity and derives its income from dividends and capital gains, has a reduced economic substance test and is only required to comply with existing ADGM reporting and compliance requirements and to have adequate number of employees and premises. In other words, it is not required to be directed and managed in the UAE, and it doesn't need to incur adequate expenditure in the UAE. Let's now take a look at the other side of the variation, which is the high-risk OP business. Now, Tim will discuss in more detail what IP business is and what is the high-risk variation. But essentially, for the purposes of this test, suffice to say that certain intellectual property activities are seen as being at a risk of being used as a form of tax avoidance. And as a result, they attract more stringent requirements under the economic substance regime. What are the consequences of being considered a high-risk OP business? As you can see on the screen, there are three. The first is the increased requirements. Now, the licensee is presumed to have not met the economic substance test. It is a rebuttable presumption, and you can see the criteria on the screen for rebutting it, which essentially involves demonstrating by the licensee that they have a high degree of control over development, exploitation, maintenance, protection, and enhancement of IP assets and the like. In addition to the increased economic substance test requirements, there are two additional consequences for being categorized a high-risk OP business. One is the increased reporting requirements for regulatory authorities, which requires us to report to the Ministry of Finance as the competent authority. And the other is the increased exchange of information requirements by the competent authority to the relevant foreign competent authority. So let's now take a look at the overview of some of the relevant activities that fall within the economic substance regime. A couple of general observations before we move into the specific discussions. One, the Ministry has articulated very clearly that all licensees are expected to use a substance over form approach in determining if they are in fact undertaking a relevant activity. So what this means is looking beyond what is on your commercial license or your financial services permission and actually consider what actual activities you are carrying out. Second, it is also worth noting that it is not necessary for a licensee to actively engage in any of these 9 activities to be considered as carrying out a relevant activity. An example is that being a passive recipient of income under a finance lease may be considered as engaging in a lease finance business. Finally, income is very broadly defined for the purposes of the economic substance regime. The current definition can be found in the Relevant Activities Guide to mean all income derived from whatever source and realised in whichever form. Obviously, we are talking about income derived from the relevant activity. So with that in mind, let's now have a look at some of the specific examples, in my case, of the financial relevant activities that the regime captures, beginning with banking business. Now, the concept of a banking business is well understood as essentially the business of accepting deposits and then using these deposits in advancing loans, guarantees, or similar facilities, as well as making of investments. In ADGM, the corresponding FSRA regulated activity under Schedule 1 of the Financial Services and Markets Regulations would include accepting deposits, providing credit, as well as their Sharia compliant equivalents. Banking business doesn't cover foreign currency exchange and money remittance, arranging or advising financial intermediaries, and currencies and commodities and money market transactions. It is worth noting that those engaged in banking business activity may also be undertaking ancillary services, such as, for example, performing financing or finance leasing activities or engaged in a service centre business. To reduce duplicate reporting, where licensees are engaged in the ancillary services, they will not need to separately demonstrate economic substance for these ancillary services. Now, a couple of examples of core income generating activities in respect of banking business are, as you would expect, raising funds, providing credit, taking hedging positions, and managing capital. The next activity is insurance business. Once again, the business of accepting risks by effecting or carrying out contracts of insurance, including reinsurance and captive insurance. Obviously, in the context of ADGM, this is subject to existing federal restrictions that any financial free zone is subject to. The corresponding FSRA regulated activity would be effecting contracts of insurance and carrying out contracts of insurance under FSMA. Insurance business activity does not cover insurance intermediation, brokers, agents, or any kind of insurance-related business that doesn't involve assuming some or all of the insured risk. And once again, to prevent any duplicate reporting, those licensees that provide captive insurance will not be considered as engaging in distribution and service centre business and will not be required to meet the economic substance in respect of that ancillary activity. The next activity is investment fund management business. So these are the licensees that provide investment management in relation to an investment fund. The corresponding FSRA regulated activity is managing a collective investment fund. Now, you can see from the Relevant Activities Guide that the concept of a fund is the focus here, so the pooling of assets. This activity does not cover fund administration, custodian, investment advisory, or any other investment fund related services. It also doesn't cover the fund vehicle itself, unless you have a situation where this is a self-managed fund. In other words, where the investment manager and the fund are part of the same entity. Once again, the core income generating activity examples for Managing an investment fund would be making decisions on holding and selling of investments, currency fluctuations, calculating risks and reserves, and the like. And then the next financial relevant activity are lease finance businesses. So these are licensees that offer credit or financing for any kind of consideration. An example of this would include loans to either related or unrelated parties. In other words, it would cover intergroup loans, finance leases, hire purchase agreements, and the like. The corresponding FSRA regulated activity is providing credit, although, as I've mentioned before, where providing credit is ancillary to being a banking business, your primary activity may in fact be the banking business. Much of it would depend on what it is that is considered to be the main activity. Lease finance business doesn't include transactions where there is no expected consideration of any kind. It also doesn't include the provision of credit where it is incidental part of another type of activity. So, for example, where you have the credit payment terms, that would not be considered as lease finance business. Now, the relevant activity guide covers these in considerable detail and also provides very useful examples in relation to each of these activities. So I would encourage you to familiarise yourself with these. I will now hand you over to my colleague Tim Land for the remaining relevant activities and no doubt what many of you are waiting for, the annual notification requirements. Thank you, and over to you, Tim.
Thanks, Natalie. So to discuss the non-financials, so the categories on the right-hand side of this slide, let me first start by saying that you won't see a reference to financial and non-financial in the economic substance law. That's a categorization that we've come up with to help explain what are the relevant activities. And I'm going to deal with the non-financial now. So headquarters business is, as the name suggests, a company that is providing services to regional subsidiaries where it's responsible for any strategic decision-making or responsible for the success of the group in the region, for example, would fall within the definition of providing headquarters business. So, for example, ABC Limited Incorporated, a company incorporated in ADGM, is responsible for setting the strategic direction of subsidiaries in the region, then that would be headquarters business. Shipping business is fairly straightforward. Shipping business is limited to companies that are operating vessels in international waters. So that's not any sort of recreation vessel operations within UAE waters. It doesn't apply to small vessels. It doesn't apply to fishing vessels. It only applies to vessels being operated by a company in international waters. And that applies whether or not the vessel is carrying cargo or passengers. The next one is holding company business. Holding company business is defined as if it's a holding company in accordance with the law applicable to the licensee in UAE, but also, and I guess really, when you're looking at how to interpret this, it's whether or not the entity has the primary function of the acquisition and holding shares or equity in other companies, wherever those companies may be located. So in ADGM, for example, quite a common scenario would be an ADGM SPV, special purpose vehicle, that's being incorporated for the purposes of holding shares in a Abu Dhabi Department of Economic Development registered company, or another company in Dubai, for example. The holding of those shares, the holding of the equity in another company and a subsidiary falls within the definition of holding company business. So as you can see, it's a narrow definition, and as Natalie has explained earlier, holding company business has a reduced substance test applicable to it. Now, holding company, a company that's been set up to hold intellectual property does not fall within the definition of holding company business. It falls within the definition of intellectual property business, which is the next one. So that's a great segue to what is intellectual property business. And intellectual property business is also a great example of where it's important to think about the substance over form aspect of this regime. In ADGM, the registration authority does not have a licensed activity or a permitted activity called intellectual property business. You won't find that on your company's license. More likely, you may have an SPV, an ADGM registered SPV that's licensed to conduct special purpose vehicle activities, and it's holding, and it may hold intellectual property. Then, as I'm about to explain, then that's where you may fall within the definition of conducting an intellectual property business without that necessarily being on your license. So what is intellectual property business? Well, it's the holding, exploiting, or receiving of income from IP assets. And what is an IP asset? An IP asset can be trademarks, patents, software, a technological process, and copyrights, and so on. Now, this business, intellectual property business, applies where you earn income from that intellectual property. So if most businesses would hold some intellectual property of some kind, for example, a brand or a trademark or copyright. But where that brand or trademark or copyright is held to support the value of the provision of the goods and services that your company provides, you're not subject to, that does not fall within the definition of intellectual property business. For the purposes of economic substance and relevant activities, intellectual property business is where you derive a directly attributable income from that IP asset. So an example of that is a company, say an ADGM SPV, again using the ADGM example, that's been incorporated to hold a brand, and that brand has been licensed out to people for royalty income in return. Then that is subject, that would fall within the definition of intellectual property business. Now, to take it one step further, and if you think about the policy perspectives and objectives of economic substance regimes and the avoidance of base erosion and profit shifting, there is a form of intellectual property business which is considered to be high-risk IP business. And high-risk IP business is defined as an entity or a company that is holding an IP asset, it's deriving income from it, and it did not create that IP asset, and it acquired the IP asset either from a group company or as consideration for funding from research and development. In those cases, the activity is a high-risk IP activity, and it's subject to an enhanced substance test. The last of the non-financial, if we could call them that, relevant activities in the UAE's economic substance regime is distribution service centre business. This is actually two separate businesses under one umbrella, under one heading. And put simply, distribution business is the purchasing of raw materials or finished products from a foreign group company, so a group entity outside the UAE, and where the UAE entity then distributes those raw materials or finished goods back outside the UAE again. So where you've purchased goods or materials or finished product from a third party, that doesn't apply. The way this definition works is if you acquire raw materials or finished goods from a group entity outside the UAE, and then you resell it again outside the UAE. In relation to service centre business, that's providing consulting, administrative or other services to a foreign group entity, so again, a group entity outside the UAE. And I would just finish by stressing that, as Natalie has referred to, the Ministry of Finance has provided a really useful relevant activities guide. It's available from the economic substance resources page that we have available on the ADGM website. You can download that and get a lot more information and lots of useful examples about how each of these relevant activities work. And so with that, I'm now going to move to the next part of my presentation, and the focus, I guess, of this presentation, which is the annual notification. Given that we are a week away from the deadline, and I want to spend a bit of time on this section, there's a few slides here to lay out the fundamentals, and then I think the best way that I can explain this is by using some examples. So I've come up with some examples here to walk you through. So, what is the ESR annual notification? The economic substance annual notification is a filing that's required to be made by all entities that are subject to the regime. So that's entities conducting a relevant activity, whether or not you're exempt or earning income. And the annual notification requires you to provide certain basic information about your situation during the report period. And this helps the regulatory authorities then ascertain who needs to then go on to file a substance return down the line. So what is it not? It's not the substance return. For anyone who's confused, they're two different things. The annual notification and the substance return are not the same. And the substance return is not required at this point in time. It will be required later. The format for that has not been issued yet. So right now, your focus should be on the annual notification. And that's the focus that's the focus here today. So on the next slide, who needs to file? And who needs to file by 30 June? There's a lot of information going around at the moment about the filing of the annual notification and the 30 June deadline. And what we want to do in this session is make it really clear for ADGM licensed persons how that 30 June deadline applies, because it does not apply to everyone. First of all, in terms of application, you must be a licensee, so that is, you're conducting a relevant activity. Again, regardless of being exempt or not earning income, the first condition is that you're conducting a relevant activity. So if you don't conduct any of those financial or non-financial activities that Natalie and I just explained at all, for example, a cafe, then you do not need to file, you're not subject to the economic substance regime, and you're not required to file an annual notification. You would never have to file an annual notification unless you start conducting relevant activities later, but you don't have to do it now. The next criterion is that you have a financial year commencing on or after 1st of January 2019, and that your financial year finishes on the 31st of December 2019. These are the three criteria for businesses who need to file by the 30th of June. So who does not? Again, if you're an ADGM registered company that conducts an activity that does not fall within the definition of a relevant activity, you do not need to file at all, full stop. If you're dissolved, struck off, or deregistered, you do not need to file. And as I'm about to show you through some examples in the coming slides, if you do conduct relevant activities, but depending on the date in which you were incorporated, or depending on the date of your financial year end, for example, your financial year didn't start on or after 1st of January 2019, and it doesn't finish on 31st December 2019, then you don't need to file by the 30th of June. You will need to file at some stage, and you can file by 30th of June if you want to, but the 30th of June deadline does not apply to you, and there will be no penalties for you if you did not file by 30th of June. So, on to the examples as the best way I think of explaining this. So example number one on the next slide. Starting with a very simple, straightforward example of a company, let's say a company that's been in existence for some time, and it has a calendar year financial year. So its financial year started on the 1st of Jan 2019, ended on 31st December 2019. That period of its financial year is the reportable period for economic substance purposes, and its annual notification is due by the 30th of June 2020. Any company, any ADGM company that falls within this scenario would need to file by 30 June, so it needs to file by this time next week at the latest. And then as per the economic substance regulations, the economic substance return would be due by 31st of December 2020, but the emphasis right now, the focus is on the annual notification. So let's move to the next example. Number 2. This is an example where, again, say you've got a company that's been in existence for some time, and its financial year period runs on a 1st of April to 31 March cycle. Then, as per the criteria explained previously, because this company's financial year did not start on or after the 1st of January 2019 and finish by the 31st of December 2019, it's not required to file by the 30th of June. This company's reportable period is from the 1st of April to the 31st of March 2020. It can file by 30 June if it wants to, but there'll be no penalties for not doing so. The due date for filing the annual notification for companies in this scenario will be announced shortly, and they would have to be adhered to. But right now, the 30 June deadline would not apply to a company in this scenario. So we'll go to the next example, please. Okay, so this is where it gets really interesting because we have the interplay now between ADGM's accounts requirements and also the economic substance regime. And so this scenario considers a company that was incorporated on the 1st of September 2018 that has a 31 December financial year. So in ADGM's companies law, you'll remember that a company must have a minimum of 6 months in its first financial period, or accounting reference period, as it's called under the company's regulations. A company can have no less than a 6-month first accounting reference period or financial year, and it must have no longer than 18 months as a first accounting reference period. So if a company was incorporated on the 1st of September 2018 and has a 31 December financial year end, then its financial year end will be the 31st of December 2019. That would represent a 16-month period because the time frame between the 1st of September 2018 and the 31st of December 2019 is too short. So it's required under the company's regulations to have a 16-month period. And again, if you go back to the criteria that for the 30 June deadline, the criteria being that your company was incorporated, that your company's financial year started on or after the 1st of January 2019 and finished on the 31st of December 2019. This company's first accounting reference period does not fall within that criteria. So its first reportable period for economic substance will be 1st of January 2020 to 31st of December 2020, and it will file its annual notification and substance return in 2021. So this is an example of a company that should not file anything right now. It would not file anything in 2020 at all. It wouldn't be relevant to file anything in 2020 because you're still in the middle of your reportable period. And only once your reportable period ends on the 31st of December 2020 will you then file the notification and return in 2021. On to the next example. So that was a long financial period. This is an example of a short period. And in this case, if you've got a company that incorporated on the 1st of April 2019 with a 31 December financial year end, again, when you take into consideration ADGM company law that says you must have either no less than 6 months and no more than 18 months, then in this particular case, the the company's first financial year will be an 8-month period from 1st of April 2019 to the 31st of December 2019. And that also falls within the definition of, or the criteria of a financial year that commenced on or after the 1st of Jan and finished on the 31st of December 2019. So a company in this situation does need to file by the 30th of June 2020. I'm sure there's probably questions coming through on all of this, and there will be a Q&A at the end. So happy to pick up as many questions as we can during the Q&A. And these slides will be available afterwards as well. So with that, I'll move to the next slide, and I think this is the last example. Okay, so what happens if you're a new licensee that incorporated on the 1st of October 2019? So this is a long financial year again, an example, where you've got a company that incorporated on the 1st of October 2019 with a 31 December financial year end. 1 October 2019 to 31 December 2019 is only 3 months. That's too short for a first financial year. So you do a long period of 15 months. And again, because you're not going to then fall within the criteria of commencing your financial year on or after the 1st of January 2019 and ending it on the 31st of December 2019, because you don't meet that criteria. Oh, sorry, beg your pardon. I take that back. You commenced your reportable period on or after the 31st of Jan 2019, but it didn't end on the 31st of December 2019. It ends on the 31st of December 2020. So again, this is an example where you would not need to file until later in 2020. The date is yet to be confirmed, but it's not the 30 June deadline because you do not fall within the parameters of commencing on or after the 1st of Jan and finishing on the 31st of December 2019. So these dates, for firms that fall into this situation where you will have to eventually file an annual notification, but it's not due by 30 June, we will communicate the deadline for those firms shortly. All right, on to the next slide, please. So how do you file? In ADGM, ADGM is administering the regime by preparing and making available an annual notification form that you can download from ADGM's website, from the Economic Substance Resources page. You download the form, as you can see there, after the title page, it's only a 3-page form where you fill in the details about your reportable period, financial year, whether or not you conducted relevant activities during the reportable period, and what they were, and so on, and then sign it. And in order to file it in ADGM, you need to then scan the signed copy and email it to ADGM's Economic Substance mailbox. That's economic substance, one word, at adgm.com. And again, happy to take any questions about the completing and the filing of the notification form when we get to the Q&A. So next slide. What are the consequences for non-compliance? I'm just going to focus on the consequences of non-compliance with the annual notification. There are other penalties for not meeting economic substance, the economic substance test, but in terms of not meeting the annual notification requirement, there's a failure to notify at all, which attracts a financial penalty of between 10,000 to 50,000 dirhams. And there's also the failure to provide accurate or complete information. So even if you did file on time that was inaccurate or not complete, you could be liable to a financial penalty of between 10,000 to 50,000 Emirati dirhams. And the next slide. Where can you find more information? We have an annual notification user guide that explains step by step how to complete the annual notification form. It's available to download from the same place that you download the form on our Economic Substance Resources page on adgm.com. The link is there, the URL you can see there. I'd also love to highlight the UAE Ministry of Finance's guidance available from its website. There's lots of good guidance and information made available there from the Ministry of Finance, particularly that relevant activities guide is really useful. And you would submit annual notifications by email to that economic substance at adgm.com email address, along with any email queries you have. We're getting lots of queries, which is great, and we're aiming to turn around queries on the same day. At this stage, we're trying to get back to you as quick as possible, and so keep the queries coming through. And the next slide, I think, might be handing over to Katrina, if I'm not mistaken. Yes. So
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Tim, for the opportunity to provide an industry perspective on implementing the economic substance regulations. Our clients are mainly financial services firms established in the ADGM and or the DIFC, to whom we provide a variety of services, including that of outsourced compliance officer and money laundering reporting officer. As a result, we've received quite a number of queries over the past few weeks on the economic substance regulations, and we've taken the initiative on helping our clients address these regulations. Now, the flow of queries that we've received suggests that many firms, not all, but many, have left this rather late and have not yet filed the annual notification, which is hardly surprising given the number of challenges that firms are currently facing. So with 1 week to go until the 30th of June deadline, I'd like to share with you a very quick overview of what you can do to satisfy your firm's obligations under the economic substance regulations in respect of the annual notification. The slide on the screen outlines a very simple but effective approach that we've seen some firms take. Firstly, allocate responsibility. We always get asked this question in respect of any new legislation or regulation. Who in the firm should be doing this? The simple answer is your senior management. For financial services firms, your senior management is normally defined as your compliance officer, your finance officer, or your SEO. For non-financial services firm, this is going to be your SEO or your general manager. Basically, someone senior who understands your business and make sure they have the resources. What does resources mean? In most cases, just give that individual the time to do the analysis. And for others, it may also include getting some external advice. Now, secondly, determine whether your firm is actually conducting a relevant activity. Now, Natalie and Tim have covered this and have stated that you must take a substance over form approach. It's not just about what's stated on your FSRA or your commercial license. Now, as a senior manager, you should know your firm's business activities, but to assist with this, you may wish to do a quick check on how you describe your activities in your business plan. And with some clients, we've found where there's been a little bit of ambiguity on what their activities are, we've actually gone and drilled down into the client agreements to better understand those business activities. Once you've got that clear understanding of the business activities, what you want to do next is map them with the relevant activities and establish quite simply whether your business activities match those relevant activities. Again, as Tim and Natalie have said, the relevant activities guide issued by the Ministry of Finance is an especially helpful guide. It's actually only 24 pages long. Put your focus on section 3, where it describes in detail the relevant activities. It's a very, very user-friendly document and it's in plain English. Do a mapping of your business activities with the relevant activities. Now, record this decision. We have a little mantra in compliance. If it's not documented, it's not done. Make a file note. The file note isn't anything complicated or sophisticated. It can take the form of a simple email. That email should reflect your rationale and your recommendation. The rationale is the exercise that you've done above, the mapping of whether your business activities match with the relevant activities. And as Tim's touched on, do a check on the financial year ends. And that rationale will then lead to your recommendation. If your recommendation is no, you don't need to file an annual notification. Of course, please be careful to note that might not be the case next year. Just because you don't have to file an annual notification this year doesn't mean that will also be the case next year. So make a note of that in your file note. If you do come to the conclusion that yes, you do have to file an annual notification, then note how you're going to do that. i.e., you're going to complete the annual notification form and you're going to email that to the economic substance at adgm.com. Engage other members of your senior management. They may be aware of business activities that you're not. As a guide, I would say make sure you engage the SEO, the compliance officer, and the finance officer. They should review your decision and confirm whether they agree or whether not. Okay, get consensus. And inform your board. You probably won't have time for a board meeting, and in most cases, an email will be sufficient. A board meeting won't be necessary, an email will be sufficient. If you have come to the conclusion that you need to file that notification, file it. File it before the 30th of June. Then pause. Congratulate yourself on meeting that deadline and avoiding any fines, and then get planning. Get planning for next year. Update your calendar of returns to reflect the deadlines for the annual notification, and then get planning for phase 2. Phase 2 will only apply to those firms that have actually filed an annual notification. And phase 2 is essentially 2 things. Establish whether you will have to file an annual return and ensure that you meet the economic substance test criteria. So to conclude, please address the annual notification as a priority. Read the Ministry of Finance Relevant Activities Guide. It's very, very useful. And if you do have to file an annual notification, please do so before the 30th of June deadline. Following which, get planning for phase 2. Do you need to file an economic substance annual return? And do you meet the economic substance test criteria? Thank you everyone for your attention. And with that, I'll pass you back to Shama, who will lead the Q&A session. Thank you everyone.
Thank you, Katrina. We are going to start our Q&A session now, and I can see that we received some questions. I'm going to read them to our speakers. We have a question from Deepak Palau from LinkedIn. By substance over form, we are falling under holding business, but on license issued by ADGM. Our legal entity is a private company limited by shares. Do we still fall under holding company business? If yes, what are the compliance requirements from ADGM for such a company to pass ESR test? Also, we have our registered address as ADGM office address, but only our shareholder is sitting in the Dubai Group premises. Will these premises still fulfill the ESR test? Natalie, do you want to answer this question?
Certainly, Shama. I can attempt to answer some parts of this question. Deepak, thank you very much. It is a good question. So I guess to start with, by substance over form, what the ministry is in fact asking is that you consider specifically the cabinet resolution, the guidance, and the relevant activities guide for holding company business, and ask yourself whether what the company is doing is holding equities and whether this is the primary function of the company. If the company meets that criteria, then and only then will you be considered to be a holding company business. If the company doesn't meet that criteria, unfortunately, you're not out of the woodwork yet, because it may meet the criteria for one of the other relevant activities that is captured by the regime. So the best suggestion that we have for you is to, first of all, take a look, familiarize yourself with the activities, including, for example, the service and distribution business. Identify whether you are conducting the activity, and if you find that you do conduct one of these activities, the first thing to focus your attention on is the annual notification. Now, this is the primary focus for now. You are not yet worrying about meeting the economic substance test and meeting the requirements. That will come later. What the annual notification is designed to do is to, first of all, identify those licensees that may be required to file the annual notification. So perhaps that will assist you in prioritizing how you need to look at these things. That's probably how I would start. I hope that helps.
Thank you, Natalie.
Shama, can I add to that as well?
Yes.
So that also brought up something that we've seen coming through in terms of questions as well, which is that there's a little bit of confusion from people about the legal personality versus the relevant activity. So just to clear that up, it's regardless of your legal personality, whether you're a company, a partnership, a branch, and so on, whether or not you're subject to this regime is whether or not you conduct relevant activities.
Thanks, Tim. We have another question from LinkedIn. Kashbu is asking, if an SPV is set up but doesn't actually hold anything during the financial year, is it considered to be a holding company by virtue of its commercial license, even though if a substance over form approach, it wouldn't be because it is essentially dormant? Natalie?
Certainly. Once again, I think looking at the substance over form approach, you've identified that you have an SPV, which may indicate that you are in fact engaging in a holding company business. However, that is not the conclusion of the analysis. What we now need to do is we now need to specifically look at what the SPV is doing. So if the SPV is dormant, then it may not yet need to meet the requirements. But again, you will have a better understanding of what activities have been conducted and what has been the primary function of that SPV. And that is something that we probably don't have information on at this stage. So I would say take a closer look and then identify where you are in the life cycle of the SPV.
Thank you, Natalie. We have a question from Naveen. If a company is not charging any fees to a foreign subsidiary, will it still be falling under HQ business? Who wants to answer this, Tim?
Yeah, thanks, Shama. Was the question regarding headquarters business, the relevant activity of headquarters business?
Yes.
Yeah. So the definition of headquarters business is if it's providing any services that would be necessary for the success of the group or those subsidiaries. And I think it's regardless of whether or not you're earning income from that activity. But I'm happy to double check that one and confirm that back to you.
Okay. Naveen is also asking, will operating lease be part of lease finance business? Natalie, do you want to answer this?
Certainly, I can suggest that Naveen perhaps take a closer look at the guidance on the relevant activities. We, of course, as a regulatory authority, cannot answer questions as to whether somebody specifically conducts or doesn't conduct the activity, because we don't have the same information as our licensees do. So if Naveen could have a look at the definition and the examples of the lease finance business provided in the relevant activities guide, and specifically the very broad definition of consideration that can be used for the purpose of that relevant activity, I think that may go a long way to answering that question. I mean, without knowing more information, I would say probably could fall within that relevant activity. But again, take a look, and obviously if need be, consider getting independent advice on that.
Thank you. We have a question from Vasanda. Does a classic trading company importing goods from abroad and selling into the UAE market fall under the scope of distribution and service center? Wants
I'm
to
happy to
answer this?
take, I'm happy to
Sure.
take that one, Shannon. So lots of questions about relevant activities today, but that's okay. The only thing is we can only answer them generically, as Natalie has just explained, and certainly not specifically to any one particular business. But in general, the purchasing of goods from outside the UAE and selling them in the UAE, in general, may not fall within the definition of distribution business because it's defined as purchasing goods from a group entity that's outside the UAE and selling them back outside the UAE. So not selling them within the UAE. But again, it's best to take a look at the guidance from the Ministry of Finance on relevant activities to get an answer on that.
Thank you, Tim. We have a question from Nico Van. SFO holding equity in other companies. Is this license considered to carry on another activity?
Yeah, Nico. Yeah, so great question, Nico. Of course, the holding of equity would probably fall within the definition of holding company business, but single-family office activities in their own right is not defined as a relevant activity. You have to look through what the business is doing and to see if it's conducting any other kind of relevant activity in addition to holding equity. But then, of course, if it's doing multiple different relevant activities, it's not holding company business in its own right, because that's an exclusive type of relevant activity.
Thank you, Tim. Another question from Mark Jones. The federal regulations refer to the ES test being for a financial year, which refers to the company constitutive documents. However, Tim has said the reportable period will be driven by the ADGM company regs requirements for first accounting reference date, i.e. needs to be 6 to 18 months regardless of whether the company makes up accounts for a shorter period. Thoughts, Tim?
Yeah, I'd be happy to take that one. Again, thanks, Mark, for your question. So the company's constitution would specify whether or not, say, for example, it wants to have 31 December or 31 March or 30 June as its financial year end. And then that needs to be taken into consideration along with ADGM's company's law around accounting reference periods. So a company that has a 31 December financial year, then generically needs to apply that in the context of when it was first incorporated versus when that first financial year end is going to be, whether it's 31 December 2019, 31 December 2020, based on the ADGM company's law requirements. It gets easier after the first accounting reference period once companies are on a typical 12-month cycle. But that's the interplay between the company's constitution, ADGM company's law, and then also the economic acceptance regime.
Thank you. Nasluh Raslan is asking, if an SPV is used as part of a financing securitization transaction and doesn't own any downstream assets, would this qualify as a relevant activity? Who wants to take this question?
Thanks, Nassar, for that question. Lots of relevant activity questions, which is great, but no annual notification questions. Nassar, happy to take that one up with you offline, but it's probably easier if you suggest to us what kind of relevant activity you think that might be. Are you trying to ask whether or not that would be holding company, whether or not that's lease financing? And again, the best thing that we can do is direct you to the Ministry of Finance's relevant activities guide, because it's difficult for the regulatory authority to can't in fact provide advice to any specific company on whether or not they're conducting relevant activities.
Thank you, Tim. I think the time is up. So if you have any more questions, you can send them through and we will be happy to answer them offline. You can also email us at economicsubstance@adgm.com. Our speakers, do you have any final comments? Natalie?
Yes, thank you, Shema. Just a couple of things. One is to thank everybody for taking your time out of your busy day to attend this and to hopefully have some of your questions answered and learn a little bit more about the requirements. And then the other is to reiterate that the economic substance is a federal regime. So it's not ADGM legislation, which unfortunately leaves us with some difficulty as well because we're not interpreting legislation that we wrote. Each regulatory authority, including the ADGM, is working very closely with the Ministry of Finance to make sure that there is consistent interpretation, implementation, and administration of the regime across the country. Having said that, we are aware that there are some differences in the approach. For example, different regulatory authorities have had different dates for annual notification and different requirements in respect of who was required to file the annual notification. If you are here, we're operating on the assumption that the ADGM is your regulatory authority, and we obviously encourage you to ensure that you understand what the requirements applicable to you are. And as Shema has already said, if you do have any further questions or would like some clarification, then please take a look at the resources on our dedicated ESR website and feel free to reach out to any one of us after the session. Thank you.
Thank you, Natalia. Katrina?
Yes, from the questions that we've received today, we can see that there still is a lot of questions regarding whether the firm is actually conducting relevant activities or not. And from the questions that we've received from our clients, we've established that many clients just actually haven't read the relevant activities guide yet. So please do pick up the relevant activities guide. It's a very user-friendly document, and given that you know your business activities really well, you'll be able to map your business activities against the relevant activities detailed in that guide. So I would urge people today, do look at the relevant activities guide. It's super helpful.
Thank you. Tim?
Yeah, thanks, Shema. We'd also like to thank everyone for coming today and taking the time. My key takeaway would be that for ADGM, not everyone needs to file an annual notification. If you're not subject to the regime, if you don't conduct relevant activities, you will not have to file an annual notification with ADGM. Then if you do conduct relevant activities and are subject to the regime, depending on your financial year, is whether or not you need to file by 30th of June. Some will, based on those criteria I mentioned. Others don't need to file yet. That time will come later. And so please check that to determine whether or not you need to file and when you need to file.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you, our speakers, and thank you for joining us today. We hope you found the session useful. Please stay safe and stay tuned for more ADGM webinars soon. Thank you.